When you withdraw emotional access completely, you are not playing a tactic. You are restoring psychological order. A narcissistic woman does not bond through mutual presence or shared meaning. She bonds through emotional extraction. Your reactions, your explanations, your visible confusion, these are not signs of intimacy to her. They are evidence of leverage. The moment you understand this, something fundamental shifts inside you. You stop mistaking intensity for connection. Carl Jung spoke of the shadow as the part of ourselves that reacts unconsciously. Emotional over-availability is often a shadow expression, an unexamined need to be seen, chosen, or validated. When you continue to offer emotion to someone who exploits it, you are not being loving, you are being unconscious. Withdrawal, in this sense, is not punishment. It is awareness made visible. When emotional access disappears, the narcissistic dynamic loses its oxygen. There is no argument to win, no reaction to provoke, no inner world to invade. This is deeply unsettling for someone who depends on control to feel real. Silence, calm, and emotional restraint force her to confront something she avoids at all costs, the limits of her influence. And it is precisely here that regret begins, not as longing for you, but as the discomfort of lost power. Many people confuse this withdrawal with coldness or avoidance. It is neither. It is containment. You are no longer leaking your inner life into a system that cannot respect it. You are choosing to hold your emotions with discipline, not to suppress them, but to place them where they can be met with reciprocity. This is maturity, not indifference. Over time, the absence of your emotional availability rewrites the psychological contract. She remembers a version of you that was responsive, explainable, accessible, and realizes that version is gone. What replaces it is something she cannot manipulate, composure, and here is the deeper truth. Regret does not come from losing love. It comes from losing access to someone who once made you feel powerful. When you withdraw emotional access, you do not disappear. You become sovereign. At a certain point, you must recognize that the desire to be understood can become a psychological trap. With a narcissistic woman, explanation is rarely a bridge. It is an invitation. Every clarification you offer, every attempt to defend your intentions or correct her version of events, gives her more material to reshape the narrative. You believe you are communicating. She is evaluating how much influence she still has. This is why the need to be understood keeps you stuck long after the relationship has fractured. From a Jungian perspective, this urge often comes from the ego's fear of misrepresentation. We want our inner image to be mirrored accurately by the other. But when the other is incapable of true recognition, the attempt becomes self-betrayal. You begin speaking not from clarity but from anxiety. And anxiety, psychologically speaking, always signals a loss of inner authority. A narcissistic personality does not seek understanding in the mutual sense. Understanding would require empathy, and empathy dissolves control. What she seeks is compliance, agreement with her emotional framing. When you explain yourself, you are unconsciously negotiating your worth. You are saying, if I can just say this correctly, I will be treated fairly. That moment never arrives, because fairness was never the currency being used. The shift happens when you stop narrating yourself, when you allow your actions, boundaries, and silence to stand without commentary. This feels uncomfortable at first, because silence removes the illusion of control you had through words. But psychologically, it restores something far more valuable, self-definition. You no longer require her interpretation to stabilize your sense of self. As this pattern breaks, something subtle but profound occurs. She is left alone with her own assumptions, no corrections, no reassurance, no emotional labor from you, and that unresolved space is where regret forms. Not because she suddenly understands you, but because she realizes she can no longer shape how you are seen, even in your absence. The deepest power is not being understood by the wrong person. It is no longer needing to explain yourself to them at all. When you begin rebuilding your identity without her, you are stepping into what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming a whole person, rather than a reflection of someone else's needs. In a narcissistic dynamic, your identity slowly becomes relational. You adjust, accommodate, and soften parts of yourself to maintain harmony. Over time, you are no longer living from your center, but from her reactions. This is why the end of such a relationship often feels disorienting. It isn't just loss, it's the collapse of a borrowed structure. A narcissistic woman does not grieve the person you are becoming, she grieves the function you once served. When you begin rebuilding independently, physically, psychologically, and spiritually, you remove yourself from that function. This is not a performance meant to be seen by her. The moment it becomes performative, you remain psychologically tethered. True rebuilding happens quietly. It is disciplined. It is often invisible. Jung warned that when a man does not live his own myth, he is forced to live someone else's. Reclaiming your identity means returning to your values, your rhythm, your sense of direction. It means training your body not for appearance but for self-command. It means ordering your days around purpose rather than reaction. Each of these acts signals something profound. At a psychological level, you are no longer available for enmeshment. What unsettles a narcissistic personality is not your success itself, but your independence from her evaluation. When she senses that your growth does not require her approval, curiosity, or validation, a deep rupture occurs. You have exited her internal hierarchy. She cannot place you, and what cannot be placed cannot be controlled. Over time, she remembers a version of you that revolved, adapted, and returned. But the person standing now moves forward, not in defiance, but in alignment. This is where regret takes root, not because she lost someone impressive, but because she lost access to someone who no longer needs her to exist meaningfully. Rebuild your identity as if no one is watching, because the moment you no longer need to be seen, you become unforgettable. Treating her absence as permanent is one of the most psychologically disruptive actions you can take, not because it is dramatic, but because it is final in a way narcissistic dynamics are not prepared for. In these relationships, separation is rarely experienced as an ending. It is viewed as a pause, a withdrawal, or a strategic silence before re-engagement. The narcissistic psyche assumes return. It assumes you will circle back, reach out, or emotionally wait. When you don't, something breaks in the internal logic of the bond. From a Jungian lens, this expectation of return is rooted in repetition compulsion, the unconscious belief that past dynamics will always reassert themselves. You have returned before. You have forgiven before. You have re-entered the orbit. When you treat her absence as permanent, you interrupt the cycle. You refuse to reenact the script. And psychologically, this is far more unsettling than anger or confrontation. This does not mean bitterness or symbolic gestures of closure. It means reorganizing your inner life as though the chapter is closed, even if the door remains unlocked. You stop checking for signs. You stop holding space for a future conversation. You stop preserving emotional readiness. In doing so, you reclaim time, attention, and psychic energy that had been frozen in anticipation. Narcissistic control depends on emotional parking, knowing someone is still there, waiting, orbiting. When that assumption dissolves, so does the sense of dominance. She may not consciously register it at first, but on a deeper level, she feels the loss of certainty. You are no longer a possibility. You are an absence with momentum. Regret does not emerge because she wants reconciliation. It emerges because she recognizes that the dynamic cannot be restarted at will. The option has expired, and expiration, psychologically, carries far more weight than rejection. When you treat her absence as permanent, you are not closing a door to provoke reaction. You are opening a life that no longer pauses for someone else's return. And nothing is more unsettling to someone who relied on your availability than realizing you have moved on without waiting. Refusing to engage in closure conversations is often misunderstood. because we have been taught that resolution comes through dialogue. In healthy relationships, that can be true. But in narcissistic dynamics, the request for one last talk is rarely about understanding or healing. It is about regaining narrative control. Whoever frames the ending controls the meaning of the relationship, and meaning is power. From a psychological standpoint, the need for closure is the ego's attempt to reduce uncertainty. We want the story to make sense. We want the ending to feel clean. But Jung understood that not all psychological processes resolve through explanation. Some require withdrawal, containment, and acceptance of ambiguity. When you engage in closure conversations with someone who thrives on distortion, you reopen the very wounds you are trying to heal. A narcissistic woman often seeks closure not to conclude, but to reset the dynamic. She may appear reflective, remorseful, or suddenly articulate. This creates the illusion of progress. Yet beneath the surface, the same patterns remain intact. The conversation becomes a subtle negotiation of blame, a reframing of events, or an emotional test to see whether she still has access to you. By refusing these conversations, you remove her ability to rewrite history in real time. You deny her the chance to extract one more emotional response, one more explanation, one more display of vulnerability. This is not avoidance, it is discernment. You are recognizing that some doors do not lead forward, no matter how many times they are opened. True closure does not require mutual agreement. It requires internal coherence. When you decide that your understanding is sufficient, you reclaim authorship of your experience. You no longer need her acknowledgement to validate your reality. What follows is deeply unsettling for a narcissistic personality. There is no final scene, no emotional punctuation, no sense of control over how the story ends. The narrative remains unresolved, not for you, but for her. And unresolved narratives linger in the psyche far longer than confrontations ever do. Closure is not something you receive from another person. It is something you grant yourself the moment you stop asking permission to move on. Becoming calm where you were once reactive is not a surface-level change. It is evidence of deep psychological integration. In narcissistic dynamics, reactivity is the primary point of contact. Emotional spikes, defensiveness, urgency, and intensity are not side effects. They are the channels through which influence flows. When those channels close, the entire structure begins to collapse. From a Jungian perspective, reactivity signals an unconscious complex. Something inside you is being touched that has not yet been integrated, often a wound tied to abandonment, validation, or self-worth. A narcissistic woman instinctively senses this and presses on it, not always maliciously, but compulsively. When you respond emotionally, the complex remains active. When you remain calm, the complex dissolves. Calm is not passivity. It is the ability to remain present without being pulled into someone else's emotional gravity. This is why emotional neutrality feels so threatening to a narcissistic personality. There is no feedback loop, no escalation, no proof of impact. Without reaction, there is no confirmation of relevance. As you develop this calm, something subtle shifts in her perception of you. The version of you she could provoke, destabilize, or pull back into intensity no longer appears. Instead, there is steadiness, company, containment, distance without hostility. This contrast forces an internal reckoning. She remembers how easily she once accessed your emotional world, and now finds the door closed without confrontation. Regret forms in this gap, not because of affection rekindled, but because control is no longer possible. Calm communicates a message that words never could. You are no longer psychologically available for manipulation. You are no longer organized around her reactions. Jung believed that true transformation is always accompanied by a loss. Something old must die for something integrated to emerge. In this case, what dies is reactivity. What emerges is self-command. When you can stand steady where you once trembled, you no longer need distance to protect yourself. Your composure becomes the boundary. And that is the moment you are truly free.